Nobody expected it to unfold like this. One moment, everything looked calm on the surface, and the next, a quiet clip of Claressa Shields had the entire internet pausing mid-scroll. There were no loud accusations, no explosive headlines at first, just a subtle shift in her expression, a pause in her words, and eyes that looked like they were holding back more than she was ready to say. And somehow, that silence said everything. Because almost at the same time, people started noticing something else. Papoose was being seen again with Remy, not in rumors, not in speculation, but in ways that felt real, grounded, and impossible to ignore. That's when the questions started flooding in. Was this always the plan? Did something change behind the scenes? Or was someone left believing in a story that was never fully true? And the hardest part? The emotion didn't come from anger. It came from realization. Because sometimes, the most painful moment isn't when everything ends, it's when you finally understand where you were never meant to stay. Before any tears surfaced, before the internet started piecing together timelines and forming opinions, everything existed in a space that felt intentional, almost carefully constructed. For Claressa Shields, this wasn't something that appeared chaotic from the beginning. It didn't feel like confusion or uncertainty. It felt like clarity. Conversations reportedly carried weight. Words didn't feel random or empty. They felt chosen, delivered with a kind of confidence that naturally lowers your guard over time. And that's where it all begins. Because trust doesn't usually come from grand gestures. It builds quietly, in consistent moments, in conversations that feel grounded, in reassurance that sounds believable enough to become reality in your mind. Claressa wasn't stepping into something reckless. Sources claim she believed she was stepping into something defined. Something that had direction. Something that wasn't competing with the past, but moving forward beyond it. But the past was never really gone. Remy wasn't just a name attached to history. She represented something deeper, a foundation that had already been built long before Claressa entered the picture. And that foundation carried years of loyalty, public support, and a story that fans had watched unfold in real time. When people think about Papoose, they don't just think about music. They think about the man who stood by his partner during one of the most difficult chapters of her life, the man who publicly embodied commitment when it mattered most. That kind of reputation doesn't disappear easily. It shapes perception. It influences how people interpret everything that comes after. And in this situation, that perception may have made things feel more secure than they actually were. Because when someone is known for loyalty, their words carry extra weight. Their reassurance feels stronger. Their intentions seem clearer, even when there might be layers that aren't fully visible. Reportedly, that's what made the situation so convincing. Claressa wasn't navigating something that felt hidden or secretive. The dynamic, at least in the beginning, didn't raise immediate concerns. There wasn't a sense that she was stepping into something unresolved. Instead, there was an understanding, or at least the impression of one, that whatever existed before had already been addressed. But sometimes, what looks like closure is just silence. And silence can be misleading. At first, everything moved in a way that felt natural. Communication was consistent. The tone remained steady. Plans, even if they weren't fully detailed, sounded like they had direction. There was no urgency, no pressure, no obvious red flags that would immediately make someone question what was being built. That's what made it real. Because chaos usually announces itself early. It shows up in contradictions, in inconsistencies, in moments that don't quite align. But reportedly, this situation didn't feel like that in the beginning. It felt structured. It felt calm. It felt like something that could actually grow into something meaningful. And that's where emotional investment begins to deepen. Because once you believe in the structure of something, you start building within it. You stop questioning every detail. You start trusting the flow instead of analyzing it. And when that trust settles in, it becomes harder to recognize when things begin to shift. But they did. Not all at once. Not in a way that immediately demanded attention. Just small changes, subtle enough to overlook at first. Responses that took a little longer. Conversations that didn't feel as grounded as they once did. Reassurance that stayed the same, even when circumstances seemed to be evolving. And that's where the tension quietly starts. Because real clarity evolves. It adapts. It grows stronger over time. But when reassurance becomes repetitive instead of progressive, it creates a gap. A space where doubt can begin to form, even if you're not ready to fully acknowledge it yet. Claressa reportedly noticed these shifts, but she didn't immediately react to them. And that's human. Because when something has felt real for a certain amount of time, you don't rush to question it the moment it slightly changes. You give it space. You tell yourself there are explanations. That people get busy. That situations become complicated. That not every shift means something is wrong. Patience becomes the response. But patience can sometimes delay clarity. At the same time, the outside world began doing what it always does. Observing. Speculating. Connecting dots that may or may not have been connected. Social media started picking up on moments, interactions, appearances that seemed ordinary on the surface, but began to look different when viewed together. At first, it was easy to dismiss. The internet often builds narratives out of fragments. A photo here. A clip there. A moment taken out of context and turned into something bigger. But the problem arises when those fragments start aligning with the subtle feelings you've already been trying to ignore. Because then, they don't feel random anymore. They feel like confirmation. Still, Claressa didn't jump to conclusions. Sources suggest she approached the situation carefully, asking questions without creating conflict. Trying to understand rather than accuse. And the answers she reportedly received sounded right. They carried the same confidence as before. The same tone that had built trust in the first place. But something was different. Because even when words sound right, they don't always feel the same once doubt has entered the picture. And when answers stop grounding you, when they no longer provide the same sense of certainty, that's when things begin to shift internally. The foundation doesn't collapse immediately. It starts to weaken. And then came the moment that changed everything. Not through a private conversation. Not through a direct explanation. But publicly. In a way that didn't leave much room for interpretation. Papoose appearing back alongside Remy in a way that felt real, visible, and undeniable. That's when the timeline started replaying itself differently. Every conversation. Every reassurance. Every moment that once felt stable suddenly looked incomplete. And the realization didn't come with immediate anger. It came with something quieter. Something heavier. Understanding. Because the hardest part wasn't just what was happening in that moment. It was what that moment revealed about everything that came before it. The idea that maybe this wasn't a sudden decision. That maybe it wasn't confusion or uncertainty. That maybe it was something that had always been there, just not fully acknowledged. A connection that never truly closed, even if it appeared distant from the outside. And once that thought settles in, everything changes. Because it shifts the narrative from something ended to something never fully ended at all. For Claressa, that realization reportedly didn't explode outward. It stayed internal. It processed quietly. And when emotion finally surfaced, it didn't feel like performance. It felt like someone coming to terms with a truth they weren't prepared to fully face. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just real. Her words, when she spoke, reflected that. Careful. Measured. Almost like she was still trying to piece together how everything fit. She talked about trust. About believing what was said, because it was said with conviction. About investing in something that felt certain at the time. And as she spoke, the deeper layer of the situation became clearer. This wasn't just about losing someone. It was about realizing that the space she believed she was building in may have never been as solid as it seemed. And that realization, more than anything else, is what created the emotional weight people felt when they watched her. Because it's not just about heartbreak. It's about clarity arriving later than you expected. And when it does, it doesn't just change how you see the present. It changes how you understand the past too. As the situation continued unfolding, the tension didn't explode all at once. It stretched. It deepened. It lingered in that uncomfortable space where nothing is fully confirmed, yet nothing feels the same anymore. For Claressa Shields, the realization didn't arrive as a single moment of truth. It came in layers, each one peeling back another version of what she thought she understood. At first, there was still a part of her that seemed to hold on to possibility. The idea that maybe there was an explanation that hadn't surfaced yet. Maybe what the internet was seeing wasn't the full picture. Maybe there was context missing, something that would eventually make everything make sense again. Because when you've been given certainty, when someone has spoken to you with conviction, it's hard to immediately accept that those words might not have aligned with reality. So she stayed composed. Not because everything felt okay, but because she was still processing. Still waiting. Still giving space for clarity to show up in a way that didn't completely dismantle what she believed had been real. But clarity didn't come in the way she expected. It didn't arrive through a private conversation or a direct explanation. It came through visibility. Through what could be seen rather than what was being said. And what was being seen told a different story. Papoose and Remy appearing together again, not subtly, not in a way that could be dismissed as coincidence, but in a way that felt grounded and intentional. That's when the emotional shift became undeniable. Because at that point, it wasn't about speculation anymore. It wasn't about connecting dots or interpreting posts. It was about confronting something that looked real enough to stand on its own. That's when everything started to unravel internally. Because once reality becomes visible, the mind immediately goes back. It replays everything. Every conversation, every reassurance, every moment that once felt certain suddenly gets re-examined under a different light. And what used to feel like clarity starts to look like something else entirely. Not necessarily lies, but something incomplete. An incomplete truth has a different kind of impact. It doesn't just hurt because of what happened. It hurts because of what you believed while it was happening. It forces you to question not just the other person, but your own understanding of the situation. And that's where the emotional weight intensifies, because now it's not just about loss. It's about realization. Sources claim that when Claressa began speaking more openly, her tone reflected that shift. She wasn't loud. She wasn't aggressive. There was no sense of trying to attack or expose. Instead, her words carried a kind of controlled emotion, like someone trying to explain something they were still actively understanding themselves. She talked about trust. About how certain things were said with confidence, how that confidence made it easier to believe that everything was clear. She spoke about consistency, about how things didn't feel chaotic in the beginning, which made the later confusion even harder to process. And the more she spoke, the more it became evident that this wasn't about a sudden betrayal. It was about a gradual realization. Because the truth didn't arrive all at once. It built over time, quietly, until it reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. And when it finally settled, it didn't create explosive anger. It created something heavier. Disappointment. Not just in what happened, but in how it happened. Because one of the most difficult parts of situations like this isn't the ending itself. It's the way the ending unfolds. The absence of a clear conversation. The lack of a moment where everything is laid out honestly, allowing both sides to understand where they stand. Instead, what reportedly happened here felt like a shift without closure. A transition that occurred without a direct acknowledgement of what was changing. And that's where the emotional break becomes more visible. Not because of the outcome, but because of the process that led to it. Because when someone feels like they were standing in something real, only to realize that reality was different from what they were told, it creates a kind of internal conflict that's hard to immediately resolve. That's what people saw in Claressa's reaction. Not just sadness, but processing. The kind that happens when you're trying to reconcile two versions of the same experience. One where everything felt certain, and one where that certainty no longer exists. And in that space, emotions don't come out cleanly. They don't present themselves as simple anger or simple heartbreak. They come out layered. There's confusion, followed by understanding. There's disbelief, followed by acceptance. And somewhere in between, there's that moment where everything finally clicks, where the situation becomes clear in a way that can't be undone. That moment changes everything. Because once you understand something fully, you can't go back to seeing it the same way again. And for Claressa, that understanding reportedly came with a realization that shifted the entire narrative. This wasn't about losing someone to someone else. It was about recognizing that the connection she believed she was building may not have been positioned the way she thought it was from the beginning. That what felt like forward movement may have actually been something existing alongside something else that never fully ended. And that realization reframes everything. Because now it's not about competition. It's not about who chose who. It's about understanding the structure of the situation itself. And once that structure becomes clear, the emotional response starts to change. The pain doesn't disappear, but it evolves. It becomes less about questioning what went wrong and more about understanding what was never fully right to begin with. And that shift is powerful, because it moves the focus away from external validation and toward internal clarity. The internet picked up on that shift almost immediately. Support started pouring in, not just from people reacting to the situation, but from people who recognized the emotional experience behind it. Because while the names involved are public figures, the dynamic itself felt familiar. Being reassured while something else is still unresolved in the background. Being included in a narrative that isn't fully transparent. Those experiences aren't limited to celebrity life. And that's why people connected to it so strongly. At the same time, conversations around Papoose and Remy continued evolving. Some people viewed their reconnect as something natural, a return to a bond that had always been strong. Others questioned the timing, the overlap, the way everything seemed to align without clear explanation. But the focus slowly started shifting. Away from speculation about relationships and toward a deeper discussion about communication, about honesty, about how situations are handled when multiple people are involved emotionally. Because in the end, it wasn't just about who ended up where. It was about how everyone got there. And that's what made this situation feel heavier than typical celebrity drama. Because it wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was quiet, layered, and emotionally complex in a way that made people stop and think rather than just react. And in that quiet, Claressa's voice, even when it cracked slightly, even when it paused, carried more impact than any dramatic headline could. Because it felt real. And real moments don't need exaggeration. They speak for themselves. The aftermath doesn't explode the way people expect it to. There's no dramatic interview, no headline-grabbing confrontation, no final statement that neatly ties everything together. Instead, what settles over the situation is something much quieter, and somehow much heavier. It's the kind of silence that doesn't mean peace, it means acceptance. And for Claressa, that acceptance doesn't come all at once. It builds slowly, in the space left behind after the emotions have already run their course. At first, the world is still loud around her. Social media continues to replay the clips, analyze her words, and debate what really happened. People pick sides, create narratives, and speak with certainty about a situation they were never part of. But for Claressa, none of that noise changes the core truth she's already come to understand. Because once clarity hits, outside opinions stop carrying the same weight. The questions people keep asking online have already been answered internally. She doesn't rush to defend herself. She doesn't try to rewrite the story. And she doesn't chase validation from an audience that will eventually move on to the next headline. Instead, she does something far more difficult. She pulls back. Not as a reaction, but as a decision. A conscious step away from a situation that no longer requires her energy. And that shift is subtle, but noticeable. The tone of her presence changes. The urgency that once lived in her voice, the need to explain, to process out loud, begins to fade. In its place is something steadier. Something grounded. It's not that the pain disappears, it just transforms into something quieter, something more controlled. Because pain that's understood doesn't need to be performed anymore. What makes this moment powerful isn't what she says, it's what she stops saying. The explanations become fewer. The emotional openness becomes more selective. And the focus slowly returns to something that was always there, her purpose. Her discipline. Her identity outside of the situation that briefly pulled her into its orbit. In boxing, everything is clear. You train, you fight, you either win or you learn. There's no hidden meaning, no mixed signals, no half-truths. That clarity becomes her anchor. It reminds her of a version of reality that doesn't shift based on someone else's decisions. And that reminder matters, especially after experiencing something where clarity was constantly delayed, redirected, or replaced with reassurance. Meanwhile, the public narrative continues to evolve, but not in the way it started. At first, people were focused on the drama, who was with who, what it all meant, and how it would end. But now, the conversation begins to shift. It becomes less about the surface-level story and more about the deeper pattern underneath it. People start recognizing something familiar in what unfolded. The idea of being given just enough to stay, but never enough to truly stand on something solid. The experience of trusting words that sounded certain, only to realize certainty can be constructed. The realization that sometimes, what feels like progress is actually just delay. And that's where the impact of this situation extends beyond the individuals involved. Because for many people watching, this isn't just a celebrity story anymore. It's a reflection. A reminder of how easily perception can be shaped when emotions are involved. How quickly reassurance can replace clarity if it's delivered with enough confidence. On the other side of the situation, things appear calm. There's no major public explanation, no detailed timeline offered to clear up the confusion. And that absence becomes its own kind of answer. Because when everything settles and nothing is clarified, people don't necessarily forget. They adjust. They observe differently. They listen more carefully, not just to what's being said, but to what's not being said. And once perception shifts like that, it doesn't easily go back. For Claressa, though, the most important shift isn't public. It's internal. It's the moment where understanding replaces questioning. Where she stops asking why things happened the way they did and starts recognizing what those choices revealed. Because at a certain point, the details stop mattering as much as the pattern itself. She begins to see things not through the lens of emotion, but through logic. The delays, the inconsistencies, the way certainty always seemed just slightly out of reach. And when she connects those moments, the story becomes clearer, not more complicated. It simplifies in a way that makes it impossible to ignore. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't someone being torn between two different paths. It was a situation that never fully changed from what it originally was. And realizing that shifts everything. It removes the illusion. It answers the questions that were never directly addressed. And with that realization comes something unexpected. Relief. Not immediate, not overwhelming, but steady. Because clarity, even when it hurts, has a way of restoring balance. It gives back control to the person who felt like they were navigating something uncertain. It replaces doubt with understanding. And once that happens, there's nothing left to chase. That's why the ending doesn't feel like a loss in the traditional sense. It feels like a release. A quiet exit from something that was never meant to be permanent. And that distinction matters, because it changes how the entire story is viewed. She wasn't losing something real. She was stepping away from something that only felt real in moments, but never fully existed in the way it was presented. And once that truth settles in, the need for closure fades. Because closure, in situations like this, doesn't come from conversations. It comes from clarity. From recognizing what was happening, even when it wasn't being said out loud. The internet will keep talking. It always does. New theories will form. Old clips will resurface. People will continue to debate what they think happened behind the scenes. But none of that changes the most important part of the story. The moment where understanding replaced uncertainty. The moment where emotion gave way to perspective. The moment where someone realized they were standing in a space that was never truly theirs to begin with. And maybe that's why this story resonates the way it does. Not because of who was involved, but because of what it represents. The experience of trusting something that felt real, only to realize reality was always somewhere else. But also the strength it takes to walk away once you see it clearly. Because not everyone does. Some people stay in the confusion. Some people keep asking questions that will never be answered. Some people hold on to versions of reality that were never fully true. But in this case, something different happened. She saw it. She understood it. And she chose to move forward anyway. Quietly. Completely. And without looking back. Now here's the part where I want to hear from you, because this story isn't just about headlines, it's about perspective. When you look at everything that unfolded, what do you really think happened behind the scenes? Do you believe this was all just timing and misunderstanding? Or does it feel like something deeper was always there, just hidden until the right moment? And more importantly, put yourself in that position for a second. If you were given reassurance that felt real, only to later realize it didn't match reality, how would you handle it? Would you confront everything head-on? Or would you do exactly what we just saw, step back, process it quietly, and move differently moving forward? These situations hit different, because they feel real, and everybody watching can relate in some way. So don't just scroll past this one. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's actually talk about it. If you want more breakdowns like this, stories that go deeper than just surface drama, make sure you like this video and subscribe. Because the next story we're about to get into might be even more complicated than this one.